Good morning and welcome to the meeting of the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System Budget Development Committee. I'm your chair, Vivian Moreno, and Kirk, will you please call the roll?
Moreno,
Present?
Elo Rivera, Fletcher, Goebel, McCann, Whitburn.
Here.
We have a quorum. McCann. I'm sorry, Goebel. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Clerk. And let's move on to item number 2, which is public comment. Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment?
We do have one public comment. Karina Contreras.
Hi, you know what? I have a comment on item 3. Just a comment on the minutes, so I will lower my hand. Thank you.
Does that conclude public comment, Clerk?
That concludes public comments.
Wonderful, thank you. Moving on to item number 3, the approval of the minutes for our meeting on June 9th, 2022. We do need a motion and a second. Thank you. Moved by Chair Fletcher, seconded by Council Member Elo Rivera. Let's say all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. I'm sorry?
So we have a comment for the
we had a
minute.
comment. I'm sorry. I
apologize.
apologize. So 1 second, you guys, go ahead to public comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my question on here has to do with the category of new projects. The minutes discuss the Pronto validators and adding additional Pronto validators to encourage more tapping, right? Which is something that I think MTS wants, so that there's more revenue collected. So I guess my question links that part of the minutes to some of the issues in fiscal year 24, which is one of the available options for the 50 million structural deficit is to enforce current fare policies. So I'm just kind of curious as to, is there going to be another increase in the amount of Pronto validators, and how many new Pronto validators between the last time the committee reviewed some of this stuff to now have been added? So thank you.
That concludes public comments.
Thank you. So we have a motion and a second on the floor. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please say nay. Any abstention? The motion passes unanimously. Thank you. And we're going to move on to committee discussion item. Any community committee discussions? Anything? No? Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to item number 4. It's the fiscal year 2023 operating budget mid-year amendment. I think it's Mike. Please take it away.
Good morning, Mike Thompson. I'm the Director of Financial Planning Analysis. I am joined by Gordon Meyer, who's our Operating Budget Supervisor. We'll start with our FY23 mid-year, post-mid-year amendment. So we basically review our assumptions that we're going to be revising at mid-year, starting with our revenue assumptions and the subsidy revenues. We plan on reducing federal revenues slightly, about a $250,000 reduction, basically due to service levels on our rural routes. There'll be less operating reimbursement for that. For the Transportation Development Act, or TDA, there was no change to those revenues in this amended budget. The cash receipts are coming in higher than initially planned, but with the claim process, there's going to be no change to that original claim. So those revenues will be static. For our Transnet funding, we have formula funding that we receive basically our percentage share of whatever cash receipts come in the door. And San Diego has revised that regional target up by about 5% year-over-year growth. So that will result in MTS receiving additional Transnet formula funding of about $1 million. We also receive Transnet in the form of operating reimbursement for our BRT and Midcoast services. And this is a function of whatever services on the street, less whatever passenger revenues are collected for those services, and then Transnet pays the net. So for this one, we are expecting an increase of about $1 million primarily due to the Mid-Coast side. We're doing a little bit more service than we initially planned and a little less revenues being collected. So there's a higher cost for Transnet for that service. So in total, we have about $1.7 million increase to subsidy revenues with this proposed mid-year amendment. Next, we move on to passenger revenue. And I'll talk to the chart here on the right side of the screen. This maroon line, it was last year's actuals, and you can see this drop here is free ride month when we launched Pronto. And then this green line is the budget we adopted, and this orange line through January is actual revenues. So we've been trending very close to the actual budget so far this year. So the projection for the rest of the year is sort of the same, keeping along that same trend line. And we do have growth built in to that last half of the year, sort of mirroring what we saw the last spring as well. But there's sort of a mixed message there. Ridership is actually much stronger than we initially planned. And the first full year of Mid-Coast completed in November. And then we also have the Youth Opportunity Pass that started last April. So we're about 10% ahead of budget on ridership. But the average fare, we're just not generating as much per rider as we had initially planned. So that's how we're so close to budget, is we're just generating less per passenger than originally planned. So hopefully the trend line continues with the same trend we've been seeing, and we end up about $500,000 higher based on this forecast. Our other operating revenues is a variety of miscellaneous things. We put it into 4 major categories. First is energy credits. And I put this chart here to the bottom of the slide. We have 2 major forms of energy credits. Our state credits is through the low carbon fuel standard, and then the federal credits are called RINs. So these are the prices for those 2 commodities. And you can see the blue line is the LCFS. That's the bigger dollars. There's my mouse. That is the bigger dollars. And about this time last year, was starting to fall, and it has continued to fall all the way through December. And it's sort of where we were trading about $200 for these credits. We're now getting about $60 for these credits. So we've built that into the revised forecast for the rest of this year, and we'll keep watching this for next year. The federal side is sort of a similar story. It stayed high longer, but it has gone from about $3 down to about $2 range now. So we've also built that reduction into the mid-year budget. So that's a big reduction in those targets. This $9.9 million was basically on 130 for LCFS, not even 200. So now we're down to about 60. We're reducing those targets by about $3 million on the energy credit side. Luckily, that is being offset by higher advertising revenues, primarily on our revenue vehicles. And then we're also seeing a large increase in interest income. Normally, interest income is a couple $100,000 a year. With interest rates rising, we are generating over $1 million in interest income this coming year. So all in all, it ends up being about where we budgeted, but there is lots of moving pieces within that. Our next slide just rolls up the revenue summary. You can see about $600,000 of other operating revenue increases, or 0.6% increase. Subsidies 0.7%. So in total, we're increasing revenues at the mid-year amendment by about $2.1 million, or 0.6%. Before we move on to expenses, we want to talk about service levels, because this is driving a lot of the changes in the expenses. So for our trolley operations, in the chart you can see here, we have the red bars are FY22 actuals. The green bar was what was initially planned, and the purple bar is what we proposed to amend to for this amendment. And trolley is just a little slightly under what we projected. We're getting used to trolley operations over this first year. We have it more dialed in now. We're just slightly lower than what initially planned based on last spring. On the bus side, we've had to reduce the schedules, a couple of different shakeups due to the shortage of operators. So you can see that is about an 8% decrease from our original plan, primarily due to the operator shortages on both internal and external contractors. And then the last section here is paratransit. That is 100% demand-based. So whatever demand is there, we have to put that service on the street, and we're just not seeing the demand come back as fast as we had seen the ridership come back on the fixed route side. So we had planned for some growth in that demand through the course of this year, and we haven't seen it yet. So we will reduce that budget now to what we saw in the first half of the year, We still expect it to start growing, but we're just not sure when that's going to happen. But for the rest of this year, we think we have a good number. We'll have to watch what we could do with that for next year. So moving on to the actual dollars now, starting with the personnel. Before we talk about that, I want to talk about the position tables. We have a couple changes to the position tables and personnel. We had 2 additions approved by the board last October. We're proposing other additions for 2.5 FTEs with this proposed amendment. We have a dispatch supervisor, a service person, a transit safety specialist, and then a part-time intern in the stormwater department. We also are going to be reducing 1 position. We have an open ridership surveyor position that we're just not planning on filling. So all those changes are reflected in this mid-year amendment. There's also making a slight change to how the position table is presented. We have our passenger service representatives. We've always just budget that as a bucket of hours that we expect to use. And we never really paid that much attention to how many FTEs we have there. We just always look at the actual hours we're budgeting. But we've always historically used this 0.2 FTE number that doesn't really make sense when we look at it. So we're going to change that to a 0.5 FTE, which is more appropriate, but it's not going to impact the dollars. It's just a change for the presentation of the position tables. So the story in personnel wages is really reduced staffing. We have reduced staffing on the operator side. We've had to reduce services accordingly. So there's a large savings we're seeing on regular wages just because of that operator staffing, and then also staffing shortages across the agency as we're dealing with turnover. So we're saving about $1.6 million at mid-year on regular wages, but we're more than paying for that on overtime. So overtime is increasing by $1.7 million. So you have both these things going on. Overall, we end up almost in the same place where we started, but there is a lot of moving pieces there. This next slide is on fringe benefits. You can see in the chart on the right, we're increasing fringe benefits by about $1 million in this amendment, or 1.5%. Part of that is in pension with our lower operator headcounts and overall position headcounts. We are saving some money on pension costs there. And then we're also saving some money on healthcare. If you recall from last year's budget cycle, we were disbanding at the ATU and IBU healthcare trust and moving them onto regular health plans like the rest of the agency. So there is some additional savings in this fiscal year, and then it will go back to more normal levels in fiscal year 24. And then the real big moving piece here is workers' compensation costs. We're projecting those to increase by about $1.6 million based on what we've seen so far this year and how we see that trending out for the rest of the year. Purchase transportation, we are saving a lot of money on this area. It's about $5.6 million reduction in budget, or 5.8%. This is primarily due to the service levels we talked about. The fixed route service levels have been reduced. And even though we amended that contract to increase the rate for operators in December, well, it was effective in December, we are saving almost $5.9 million in fixed route costs between TransDev and First, the minibus piece of First Transit. And the ADA, we talked about that as well. We're bringing those service levels way down, and there is a cost increase on those sides for operators as well. And that basically offset each other. It's only increasing $242,000 or 1.8%. Other outside services, we're increasing security by about $1 million. That was a contract amendment for that as well. That was approved by the board last month to increase those base wages. Our repairs and maintenance costs, we are reducing substantially at mid-year. We had a number of large rehabilitation projects built into the budget, and some of them are on track, but there's a couple of major ones that are not made it through procurement yet, and we're not going to get it done this current fiscal year. So we were planning on pushing those in FY24. That's a savings of $3.1 million in this operating budget. And then engine transmissions is favorable by $300,000 due to the experience of the first half of the year. And then other outside services also favorable. We have the Pronto operations maintenance costs that did not go into effect until January and was originally planned to be go into effect in July. Next, I want to talk about our energy assumptions. And you hear about a lot about this in the news with SDG&E, and we are experiencing the same thing here. It's all based on the natural gas commodity price. We put this chart here on the bottom of the screen, and you can see the first part of this chart is all very, very low. I mean, if you took this thing back 10 years, it would be the same thing. We always paid about $3 a decatherm for CNG, a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but just bouncing around that $3 number. And then we had the war in Ukraine last year, and globally the prices went up for natural gas. But that has sort of eased in the rest of the United States over the course of this winter. But in Southern California, we have had these tremendous spikes, and it's basically due to the storage levels in Southern California of natural gas, and also the pipelines that are feeding Southern California is creating scarcity and driving prices through the roof. We peaked at $54 in January, which is 20 times higher than normal. So that has come down for February. We're waiting to see what March looks like. And hopefully the rest of the year does come down like we're projecting here. But it's strictly a Southern California issue because nationally, the price is back to $3. It's actually closer to $2 right now, but we're still paying an elevated price here in Southern California. So that not only impacts the cost of natural gas for our buses, it impacts the cost of electricity as well. You can see we're adding a lot of budget here, both on the electricity side of $3.3 million, but on natural gas side of almost $5 million due to these issues. In total, we're increasing the energy budget by $8.3 million or almost 20%. Our other expense assumptions, we're increasing that by about $1 million or 3.2%. The big driver here is materials and supplies. We're paying a little bit more for all of our revenue vehicle parts and some equipment maintenance supplies as well. We have had some favorable claims and legal costs experience and risk. That's saving some money with this proposed amendment. And we also have higher general administrative costs as well that were built into this budget. So rolling all of that up, you can see that we're increasing expenses by $2.1 million or 0.6%. Lots of stuff going on in here. It's a very small increase, but there are lots of moving pieces. And this is also being really helped by lowering the lowered service levels. So this next slide looks at revenues less expenses, increasing overall revenues by about 2.1 million, expenses by 2.1 million. So we have exactly the same structural deficit as we did at the beginning with the original budget, and we'll be using the same federal stimulus funding to balance that budget, about $37.3 million to balance our structural deficit with that federal stimulus funding. So reviewing our overall balance of stimulus funding, and just to go over the history again, we had $360 million in total stimulus funding between CARES, $220 million, and ARP of $140 million. The plan has been to use this money to keep service on as much service as possible on the street and balance our deficits as long as we can with this funding. And you can see we used $72 million in fiscal year 21 to balance that budget. Last year, fiscal year 22 was only 48 million. And right now we're projecting 37 million to balance this budget. Now we're just drawing enough expenses to actually balance the budget. So this actually works out the last couple of years to about 5 months of actual eligible expenses that we've been drawing. So there's 7 months of eligible expenses that we haven't been drawing each year that we could have drawn and just put extra local revenue into a reserve. And with all the discussions at the federal level about the debt ceiling and how to, the trading that's going on to get that solved, there's been talk of taking this unspent money of this stimulus funding from all the agencies that haven't spent their money yet. We didn't spend ours on purpose. We have a very detailed plan of how we're going to use this. So that's causing some concern. The other thing is interest a year ago wasn't really a thing we were worried about. Didn't bring very much money, but now if you're getting 2% interest on $50 million, that also is a big compounding thing. So we're proposing a strategy change here and try to draw these federal funds as fast as possible. And then whatever excess local funds we have, we can put those funds into a reserve for future operating deficits. At our current budgeting levels, we expected this stimulus funding to last into fiscal year 27 to balance our budgets. That does not change. It's just about how we're drawing this funding and how and that piece of it is changing a little bit. So we allow us to draw it a lot faster because we would draw all year long instead of just a few months a year. So that's sort of a thing we wanted to talk about. If we can get it drawn in a couple of years, it still lasts the same amount of time. So our goal, as always, has been to balance our recurring expenses to recurring revenue streams. And we have not seen the revenue growth needed to keep up with the expense growth, especially over the last year or two. Passenger revenue is still well below our pre-pandemic levels, as you saw on that first passenger revenue chart. So we are thinking stimulus funding will last into FY27. We haven't worked on these FY25 to 27 numbers yet. We'll do that over the next couple of months and have a much better forecast for those months. Right now, we're just sort of keeping our FY24 number that we'll talk about in the next presentation sort of static. But we also have issues towards the end of this decade when Transnet, we will no longer get 100% reimbursement for our Transnet funded routes. We will get the reimbursement of whatever cash comes in the door, and it'll be an immediate loss of revenue in that fiscal year 29, fiscal year 30 timeframe of about $12 million. So that will only add to these deficits. And anything else that comes along that will also add to these deficits. So just wanted to bring that to your attention as well. But either way we do the draw piece, we still think it doesn't change how long the deficit money lasts. So if we change how we do the draws, it would look like this. We would draw more federal stimulus funding, and then we would just put whatever that excess local funding is into a deficit reserve and just use that reserve for future aid, and then also earn interest. It would grow those reserves for the next few years till we use it all. So that brings us to the staff recommendation. The recommendation is the Budget Development Committee forward a recommendation to the MTS Board of Directors to enact Resolution 23-02 that would amend the fiscal year 23 operating budget for San Diego MTS, SDTC, SDTI, contract services, and the Coronado Ferry, and also to direct staff to accelerate the draws of federal stimulus funding and create an operating deficit with those extra funds to use for future fiscal years. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mike. First, we're going to turn to members of the public. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on item number 4?
We do have one public comment, Karina Contreras.
Yes, thank you. My name is Karina Contreras, Transportation Policy Advocate for Climate Action Campaign. I forgot to preface my first comments with that I'm speaking in that capacity. Well, I, understand that the draw of using some of the stimulus funds, especially with the current interest rate, to have a deficit reserve. When it comes to building a transit system that is going to meet our climate goals and going to connect folks quickly, safely, and reliably to where they need to go, there's a huge concern with the ongoing staffing shortages, and hearing that overtime is basically making it a wash on any savings on wages. I think it's incredibly important to one, for the public to know what is a target amount of bus operators that is needed to be able to increase frequency on some of the highest impacted routes, and how is this agency going to pay for that? And perhaps, some of the deficit interest on the reserve could potentially be used for that. So just a little bit curious as to how MTS is going to tackle the staffing shortages in the bus operator category. Thank you.
That concludes public comments.
Wonderful, thank you. Moving on to members, committee member comments. Would any members of the committee like to make any comments on this item? And also just wanted to remind you guys that this is an actionable item, so I am looking for a motion and a second. Councilmember Goebel?
Thank you, Chair. As I look at the consolidated financials, I'm kind of boiling down to saying energy was $8 million more, and the savings from repair and maintenance and fewer drivers was $8 million less. And that's basically a wash. So my question is, and I think it was answered later in the staff report, when we talk about energy costs, I think I read that there's a premium to build in future contracts, guaranteed rates. That the premiums on those guarantees may not be worth locking in those rates to avoid this kind of spike. Is that correct?
Mike and I had this very conversation. Mike, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and we planned on talking about it in FY '24, looking forward. We did have this conversation last spring, and we have it every spring. And historically, when you're locking in the springtime, they're just coming off the storage build and you're paying an even higher price than you would if you locked in different times of the year. But we would have saved a fortune if we had locked in this current year. But right now, the forward-looking price is still $8 to $10 for Southern California. So we're not sure 24 is going to be $8 to $10 if the rest of the nation is paying 2 to 3. We just don't know if that's a worthwhile investment. In our 15 years looking at this, there's been 3 years that would actually have made sense to lock in. Otherwise, we would have paid probably about a 30% premium every single year. So it's certainly something we can do. It's definitely nice to have budget certainty. You don't have to worry about it when you lock in those prices. You have that budget certainty. It's just a matter of whether it's going to pay for itself over the long run.
And I guess I'm hearing your recommendation is the premium isn't worth it at this point.
I don't think we've concluded that yet, but
But yeah, we'll talk about that. We don't feel that it's worth it yet.
That would probably be a recommendation I'd like to hear when they get it, to say what their conclusion is on those things.
Okay.
To go either way. Also, are there any expiration dates that we should be aware of for this ARPA and CARES Act money? Is that kind of why we're accelerating using these funds besides the debt ceiling and interest?
There is no expiration date on the CARES funding. There is a spend by date for the ARP funding, ARPA funding, that we'll be well ahead of. Even if we did our old plan, we would not be worried about that because we're drawing those ones first. And we'll have those ones extinguished soon.
I think it's a smart idea to accelerate the funding and lock it in before it becomes at risk. So I'll go ahead and make a motion to approve the staff recommendation as stated.
Thank you, council member. Thank you, Mayor McCann. Did you wish to speak, Mayor McCann, or was that for a second?
No, actually, I think my colleague actually brought up some of the same items that I was concerned about, so I won't be redundant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anybody wish to be recognized? Councilmember Whitburn?
Thank you, Chair. Just one quick question. I also agree with the idea of using the federal funds before we use them. Is the spend down that we're looking at the most aggressive approach that we could take or not?
It might be not the most aggressive approach we take. We've been doing it. We've been drawing a certain way for the last few years. So it would be sort of continuing that same methodology. We probably could even try to be more aggressive and draw more. We could look at that.
I mean, I just ask, I mean, if Congress is looking at possibly taking it back, if it hasn't been spent, I'm just wondering about the merits of doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen, but I'll leave that to you.
Okay. Yeah, in the past, they've talked about taking back unobligated funding, which we've obligated all of our funding. So this new talk about taking back unspent funds that have already been obligated was sort of new and sort of threw us for a loop. That's why we'll keep looking at that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak? No. Okay. So we do have a motion on the floor and it has been seconded. So all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. We're going to move on to item number 5, which is fiscal year 2024 operating budget. And we have Mike with us again. Please take it away.
So these are our preliminary high-level assumptions, a lot of the known things we know about at this point in time. There's still a lot of work to be done on this budget. So starting with our revenue assumptions, on the subsidy side, we do have targets from Sandag for both TDA and Transnet. The Transnet is predicted to grow by about 1% next year. So that will increase our formula funding by 1%. It doesn't impact our operating reimbursement. That is a function of whatever costs there are, net costs are for that side. So on the TDA side, that growth is more like 3.3% because it's looking at our last year claim number, not really an end of the year cash receipts number, and to our this year claim number. So that'll be about 3.3% growth on the TDA side. For the TDA side, we also use that funding in the operating budget to match the federal funds. And we have a large increase in federal funding last year about this time. So there's going to be additional match requirements in the capital budget for that additional level of federal funding. So in the operating budget, we actually expect TDA to actually decrease by about $4 million from fiscal year 24 compared to 23, because more of it will be going into the capital budget. Transit operating reimbursement, as I said, that's the BRT services, whatever the net cost is, Transnet pays for that. And with inflation this past year, we expect the operating rates to increase, and then that will impact what we get reimbursed for that side. For state transit assistance, or STA, this is another funding source where you use both in the operating budget and the capital budget. And this historically has been a sort of a very volatile funding source. So we try to keep the most of it in capital, but we include $11.3 million in the operating budget. We've been keeping that number flat year over year for years now. So that's the plan to continue that for next fiscal year, is keep our same split. They're the same. And then our federal operating revenues in the operating budget, we expect to increase by $1.5 million. We can put preventive maintenance and other operating assistance costs in the operating budget that are federalized, and we expect that to grow by about $1.5 million. And the last assumption on the slide here, we do expect to cover whatever structural deficit we have with the stimulus funding or the stimulus reserve. Looking at our passenger revenue assumptions. So the chart on the right is the same thing I presented for fiscal year 23. I just took out the original budget. So this orange line is the amended budget, the forecast. So we've sort of, and you look at FY22, they sort of very consistent year over year, steady growth. It's not wildly growth, it's very steady growth. So we're expecting that steady growth in this first projection to just carry on out through the next 18 months. So if that growth carries out, which be this green line, that would be about 11% year over year growth, about an $8 million increase in passenger revenue next year. Now, this is something that we will keep watching, and we hopefully will have February results and March results before we have to finalize this budget. So hopefully we see either our plan is staying the same or it will keep growing even further. So we'll keep an eye on that. But with our first pass, we're projecting an $8 million increase in that revenue. Service level. So I updated the chart here. The chart is now 22 actual. The purple is 23 amended, and our initial projections for FY24 are in blue. So on the trolley side, no expected changes there. On the bus side, with the changes that we made to all the collective bargaining agreements and with the contractors, we hope that we have increased operator hiring and retention and are able to add service back starting in September of next year and more likely in January of next year with everything that has been reduced. So we don't quite get back to FY22 levels since we're adding stuff back in the middle of the year, but we're getting close back to 22 levels and much higher than FY23, which there is a cost for putting that back on the street. On the paratransit side, we're again going to plan for increasing demand. I mean, this is an expensive service. I'd rather shoot high again and then have to bring it down at mid-year than have to go the other way and have to find money to fund the service if we shoot too low. So we are planning for a 30% increase on our FY23 forecast versus our current fiscal year amended forecast. Again, that seems like a lot, but we're still only at 58% of peak levels on that ridership demand, where on the fixed route side, we're getting closer to 80–85% of our peak demand. So we just haven't seen that come back yet, but at some point it's going to come back, we believe. Moving on to expense assumptions, we will have more operator hours due to the service levels. So that will be built into the new, and there'll be a full year at the new rate structure that was approved back in October. We have headcount changes potentially. We're looking at 5 additional construction safety persons. We might have a couple more headcount changes to talk about, but right now that's all we've built into here. We want to talk about wage rate increase assumptions as well. Most of the agency is under collective bargaining agreements. Our representative groups are the ATU, IBW, SMART, and TEOA. All those agreements are in place basically through December of 2024. So past this next fiscal year. And they have increases ranging from 3.25 to 4.25 already built into those agreements. For the non-bargaining unit employees, there's a merit pool assumed of 4%, same as the current year, and a performance incentive program of 1%, same as the current year as well. No changes to that are proposed. We also wanted to discuss with the committee a COLA for all internal employees, some sort of overall inflation adjustment for across the board or to certain groups of employees, but looking at some way to help deal with the turnover for the rest of the agency, not just in the operators that we've been experiencing as well.
And actually, that's something we want some feedback from this committee. And we're seeing what happened with the bus operators earlier last year. Now is beginning to affect the trolley operators and the maintenance away people. And we've already been seeing high turnover in the administrative staff, especially in departments like IT, procurement, finance, across the board, we've been seeing that. And what we're experiencing, obviously, is being experienced at all the cities, as well as at Sandag and other places, and in the private sector. And that is people leaving to go find, more money. Or, they want to work from home, and we're a transit operator, so we can't really allow people to work from home as much. So that's why we want to bring up this idea of the COLA. I know that a lot of the other cities have experienced this and then therefore put something in like that. We would want to know if it's a non-starter and you're not interested, we probably wouldn't do much more to study it. But if you think you would like it, we would bring back something at the next committee meeting to discuss. And then we would also look at, should we be targeting specific populations? So if it's the trolley operators we're really hurting on, do they get a different percentage, et cetera? So anyway.
Other assumptions we're aware of at this time on the benefit side, our health insurance premiums are projected to increase by 10% according to our brokers for calendar year 2024. So starting January of next year, we're building that initial forecast. We'll keep monitoring that as well. As we discussed, ITU and ATU healthcare trusts are being fully dissolved. So there was some savings in fiscal year 23. So we have full costs basically in fiscal year 24 reflected for that. And then the pension costs are a known number at this point. The San Diego Transit actuary plan was approved at the board last month. That's an increase of about $1 million. And then the CalPERS side for the other employees, those actuary reports have been published as well. That's supposed to be an increase of about $1.2 million on that side. So that's all built into this forecast. We have not built any COLA into this forecast, just to be clear. Purchase transportation contract rates is another known item. We'll have increased service levels affecting these actual numbers, but the actual rates underlying that are known. Our fixed route contracts with Transdev, that fixed costs of that contract are increasing by 3.4%, and the variable rate is increasing by 3.1%. On First Transit, they operate both our ADA minibus service, or excuse me, our ADA service and our minibus fixed route service. So the ADA side, well, overall, there's some fixed costs there increasing by 4%. The ADA side, the service per hour rate increases by 2.1%. And then the minibus fixed rate increases by 4.6%. Other known items on the outside services, we have the rehabilitation projects on the rail side that we talked about that slipped from 23 to 24. We are expecting some other ones across the agency, the larger rehabilitation projects built that we're looking at for FY24's budget as well. And then next year we'll have a full year of Pronto operations and maintenance costs, whereas FY23 we just had half of the year. On the energy side, we will have additional volumes for one thing, but other than that, we do expect savings on the energy line because FY23 is so high. We're still watching that at this point. We need it to come down a little faster. So we should have March's pre-number soon, and then we'll have April's number as well before we have to finalize these budgets. So as we talked about early in last presentation, we're not really planning right now to fix prices because I think the price would even be higher, but I did the same thing last spring and I was very wrong. So we'll look at it closely and bring the numbers back to you and see what the best path forward there is. But typically there always is a premium to lock in April for the next 12 months. So we haven't been doing that for a long time. Another known area is our risk and liability insurance costs. We do expect those to be increasing. Those will be coming to the board soon as well. So here's our roll up. Again, this is our high level look at FY24. You can see a $9 million, almost 10% increase in operating revenues. That is primarily due to the passenger revenue assumption that we've talked about earlier. We're also going to keep watching our energy credits. If those prices come back, that would be a big swing on that line because we have brought the budget way down in this year 23. The California Air Resources Board said that they expect prices to keep climbing, but we haven't seen it yet. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Non-operating revenues in total is about $1.7 million growth only in that line, less than 1% in our subsidy revenues. So in total, we have about $11 million of revenue growth. Right now, we're projecting about $27 million of expense growth. This is a lot due to increased rates and also a lot due to all the extra service we're building into the FY24 plan at this point in time. We are right now projecting savings on the natural gas side and of course associated with the electricity side as well, because whatever that natural gas price does will affect our electricity rates as well. So we're projecting to go from a $37 million operating deficit to about a $53 million operating deficit with this first pass.
So I get the fun slide. So obviously I don't want to just bring to you this kind of sad structural deficit story, but it does require a lot of lead time to do things that will potentially have impacts after we hit that cliff in 2027. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the options that we do have available. And in bringing these all up, I want you to understand that I fully would expect that it has to be a combination of them. Unless, you know, suddenly the feds or the state come forward with another CARES Act type rescue of us. You know, we've been very active with the state lobbying effort to see what the state might do. They are facing huge deficits themselves. They expect that when the sales tax receipts come in later this spring, they're going to even be in a more troublesome situation. And so they're not looking to fund large bailouts for transit at this point. We are working with them to try to come up with ways, for instance, could we use more flexibility in some of the programs like the TIRCP, which is really more designed towards capital, but could they give us flexibility to put it into the operating side of the budget? So we are still working towards those things, but in light of, you know, the circumstances, we do have to look at these other options that are locally available. For instance, do we want to consider freezing the current service levels? Right now, Mike is assuming that we're going to add back the service that we've had to cut, which is about 9% of the service. So do we want to add that back in? Or do we want to freeze that? Cutting service, that's the biggest amount of money that you can do, is to get money by cutting the service. That has the biggest impact on our customers. It has the biggest impact on our employees. But really that's where the cost savings is going to be for something as large as $50 million. Enforcing the current fare policies, we have discussed this. We mentioned at the last time we talked about fares that we have about $8 million that we're estimating that we're losing because we're not enforcing the same way that we used to. So there's that. You could raise the cost of fares for the customer, but without the enforcement piece, you're not going to really see the impact of that. Plus, that has a huge impact on ridership because you will lose riders who can't afford the fares. You can defer capital investments. You know, this is something that has happened across the nation in transit agencies. You're seeing the effects of that in places like Washington DC, where they've had to shut down entire lines because of the lack of state of good repair and unsafe conditions caused by that. So, but there are things in the capital budget that you could defer. And the next line I put here is the seek relief from innovative clean transit requirements. It was always understood that when they mandate from the state for zero emission technology was put in, that there would be off ramps. They don't want you to cut service in order to accommodate this, because that is counterproductive for climate goals. But you know, there is that option as well. A large part of our capital improvement program is investing in the infrastructure and in the more expensive vehicles that are zero emission. Ballot measure. We were very close in 2020 to putting something on the ballot, and then COVID struck and we didn't. But certainly there is that option, but how you message putting a new tax in when you're just using it to backfill a budget deficit. You know, you could spend down the reserves. We have a very solid reserve plan that the board has instituted, and we have it fully funded, correct? But you know, there is that as an option as well. I throw all these out there. It's the universe that we were thinking about, and it's not great, but it's a lot of different moving parts that we are going to work on. And certainly we're open to other ideas if you have them yourselves to add to this list. Go ahead.
That actually concludes our presentation. So we have to take any questions about 24 and hear your guidance on any of these issues. Thanks.
We do have one public comment, Karina Contreras.
Yes, hello, it's Karina Contreras, Transportation Policy Advocate for Climate Action Campaign. I have two questions. My first question is regarding having additional service on bus fixed routes. How is MTS planning to increase retention of bus operators, and how many bus operators are you planning for? And my second question is, what is the methodology for restoring bus routes? Is it a focus on high demand routes, or a focus on equity and communities of concern, or some kind of overlap between these two? And both those questions, I don't see any congruency with recommendation of addressing a $50 million structural deficit by cutting service. So I'm having a hard time understanding increasing service to only then cut it down again. And all this to say that, you know, as we continue to move forward and have really lofty goals for, you know, San Diego City Climate Action Plan and state mandated targets for greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled reductions, I just don't see how we're going to get there unless we have more bus operators, have more frequency. So I was just kind of curious about the situation here. Thank you.
That concludes public comments.
Wonderful, thank you. And just a reminder to the committee, this is an informational item, but I'm going to take chair's prerogative to start the conversation, hopefully spur a little bit more of a conversation. I wanted to highlight three topics. The first topic, and this is, I'm bringing this up, this isn't the right platform, but the ADA paratransit system that MTS has, it has been brought to our attention in these two items about the budget of the ADA paratransit system we have. I don't necessarily want to talk about the budget. So this is, as I mentioned, not the right platform. We do have the chair and the vice chair of MTS. So I hope that we could have a more in-depth conversation at another committee, perhaps, on our ADA paratransit system. I think as a board member, we could start it off as an informational item just to get to know the ADA paratransit system, and also, you know, what we want it to, what it looks like and what we want it to look like as an agency. So like I said, not the right platform, but it was brought up. So I thought
I think that'd be a great informational item for a board meeting, just an overall update, presentation, discussion. So I fully support that.
Thank you. And then also, in the same presentation, we were told that we're going to have a $50 million deficit, but at the same time, we had a discussion about potential COLA adjustments, right? So we need to figure that one out. As we were being briefed for this item, one of the things that I brought up and that I would like to see is where the agency is experiencing vacancies, what percentage how far away are we from the pay of other agencies like ours? And maybe this body would like to target certain positions before we make the choice of doing just across the board COLA adjustment. So that's something that I would like to see. Once again, this is an informational item, so just throwing it out there for you guys. And not necessarily against the COLA, but just to have a holistic conversation and to make sure we're comparing apples to apples here, right? And last but not least was the state mandates. I think we should peel back and see how much money are we spending on state mandates and whether we can be successful. There are a lot of us on this board and on this committee and on this board that have a lot of juice in the state. And so, and if not, we potentially could be planting a seed here for future legislators. But I would like to discuss how we can very methodically ask the state and our state legislators to help us out, especially considering that we have a deficit and that just last year they had a gargantuous surplus, and maybe this year is not the year. Like I said, maybe we plant the seed and the year is in 2 or 3 years, but I definitely would like to explore getting funding for our state mandates. So with that, I am going to open the floor for discussion. I don't see anybody on the lights. I don't know. Chair, would you go ahead?
Yeah, look, this is a really important discussion and, we need to spend time in this committee really thinking about it in a robust way and engaging the entire board because because of the federal funding, we've had the luxury of allowing the world to kind of resettle and reset post-COVID. And so we've been able to kind of run our system. We've had to make some adjustments here and there, but we've been able to draw out of that. And now we're at a point where we got to start making some assumptions about what does the world look like post-COVID? And how do we readjust and right size to be able to be in a financially sustainable way? And what are the components or pieces of that? It's not a decision, we don't have to make a decision today, but we really need to start thinking through these because these are not easy options. None of these options are easy. And all of them will require us to make some change. And so I think some kind of ongoing efforts as a budget development committee around projections, around forecasting, around what level of what would save what from all of these different buckets. And we can start looking at how we begin to put the pieces together in various scenarios and socializing those both with the public and socializing those with the board of directors, I think is an important component. We've always assumed, well, ridership will come back to where it was pre-COVID. And it's coming back, but I don't know that when it will get back to pre-COVID levels. We've right-sized our fare enforcement. Now that also means as ridership comes back, the revenue is not coming back quite the same as it did pre-COVID. And so, these are just a lot of things that we have to take our values and match them up with the dollar amount and then make a responsible decision for how we can get back in a structurally sound way. I'm not a fan of taking reserve funds for structural deficits. Reserve funds exist for unexpected downturns. To tide you over until you come back. And so I don't think that's a wise decision, absent some type of recession or some type of triggering event that is external. But COVID was hard. It threw everyone for a loop, and we've had the value of a cushion of time. But I think we need to continue to really start putting some dollar amounts to these, putting some projections to these when we anticipate those funds will go. The other thing is if there's some ways that we can start easing into this, the expiration of those excess funds so that we don't hit a $50 million cliff, maybe we hit a $20 million cliff and thinking through a lot of those. So it's a good discussion. I'd like to see us continue to work through this.
We are going to go to Mayor McCann, followed by Councilmember Goble, then Council President Shanilo Rivera. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First, again, I think this is a great discussion and very valuable for us to be able to understand how we can get to a sustainable organization in the future, because with a structural deficit, at some point in time, that's going to come back to get us. On the COLA, I agree with Member Moreno. We don't necessarily need to be able to put that in there, but my suggestion would be, because I understand not just in the private sector, but in the public sector, many positions are not being filled, and that's creating a major competition for people to leave for increased salary rates. So what I would suggest is that we could do a annual survey salary. So we could actually be able to say, okay, where are we hitting it right on our salary compensation? Where are we behind? And then even when we have a contract, a 2 or 3 year contract, we can then be able to be flexible in saying, okay, this position is well below the market rate. Let's take action before we start losing people. So that would be my suggestion before we move to the COLA option. And then I know it's as the executive officer continued to say, none of these are a good or the nice ways to be able to, where everybody's going to be happy when we're going to implement them. But I still believe that we need to look at how we enforce our current fair policies, and to be able to do that in a fair and meaningful way. So those were my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Goble?
Thank you, Chair. As I look at it, at a 5, 10, 15-year view as well, this driver shortage thing, I think is pivotal, because especially as Sandag seeks to create this robust transportation system that depends on people operating this more robust transportation system 5, 10, 15 years from now. And if we don't have enough drivers today, where are they going to come from? Or how do we project we're going to have the drivers we need 5, 10, 15 years out for an even more robust system than we have today? So that's a concern. Is there any sense, where did the drivers before COVID go? Where are they now? Do you have a sense of that?
We do talk to drivers who are leaving, or we also talk to the ones who come to our events where we're asking them to apply and why they've chosen not to. We also talk to them when they come in for a training class and then they up and leave because they just don't like the idea of the job anymore. Our biggest competitors certainly are like the Amazon, the trucking industry, people, other bus companies, things like that. Those are certainly a challenge for us if they're paying better. And pay is one of the things that everybody talks about when they're talking to us. That's what they want, is a better pay. But the other things that affect them are, one, the environment they have to deal with, especially with bus operations, they're in the face of the public. And so they're, always dealing with a lot of people that sometimes aren't the nicest people to have to deal with. And so a lot of times they just get fed up with the job. That's the nature of the job. To some extent, we do know that, we've put the barriers up inside the cab for safety of the driver. And then we moved the line back for where passengers are allowed to stand. It's all for safety reasons for the drivers, but a lot of times that means the driver is losing that connectivity to their passengers. They're not having the same friendly interactions and the talking with them and things like that. So you can lose drivers once they start feeling like, I could be driving a truck instead of doing this. There's just a myriad of reasons. Then there's the rules, when you're a new driver, you get in line behind all the other drivers when you pick the work that you're going to do. So you might be at night working when you'd rather have the, daytime job, or you're working split shifts, which means you've got a gap in the middle of your day that you're not being paid for, but you then have to do 2 different times of the day. Those things can affect people. The drivers all pick every 3 times a year. So you might be driving a schedule for 4 months, and then the next 4 months you're driving a different schedule. And so that can impact your, work-life balance. Some people come in and they want to be able to, coach their kids' baseball team, and you can't be guaranteed to be able to do that. So there's just a whole host of reasons why. But we do have a lot of really wonderful, dedicated people who, despite all these challenges, want to be bus drivers. And those are the people that we keep trying to attract. And we are having some better success, especially since we raised the wages. And that's really, we believe, going to help us get to where we need to be.
Are you seeing the same number of applicants as you did before? As an example, some cities are seeing fewer applicants for police officers than they used to see, as many as 5,
Well-
10 times less. Are you seeing the same number of applicants?
We're seeing more now than we did a year ago. So we're doing these pop-up events. If you want, I can send out the dates when we're doing these. They're actually really fun to go to because people are really excited to come and realize that we're willing to, on the spot, hire them. We do interviews in the parking lot of the Old Town Transit Station, for instance. And they just love the excitement. I go, Mike, our COO, goes, they talk to them about the career opportunities because it is a career. This is not, I'm just going in to get a wage. This is a true career, and people, want to work at MTS. So that's an exciting aspect of it, but we are getting more people in the door now than we were a year ago.
Let's go back to slide 3 if we could. Slide 3 and slide 4 kind of go together. The green line is the forecast for FY24, and the orange line is our latest forecast for FY23. So it's up 11%. And if we're not increasing prices, that means we're getting more passengers, more volume. In order to get more volume, you got to have more routes. In order to have more routes, you got to have more drivers. So it's a pretty aggressive assumption to me to say 11% growth in passenger revenue year over year. I'd almost, in this sense, until we know that the hiring is becoming more secure and steady, to be less aggressive on these, be more flat is where I'm kind of going. 24 versus 23 in some of these things until we see the hires and the routes restored and things. Otherwise, it's going to look like we're falling short every period, and that's a concern. Revenue miles on slide 4 assumes that you go up, which means more routes, which means more drivers. And again, I think I'd be more conservative and peel back a little bit would be my recommendation. On your last slide, addressing the $50 million deficit, what we haven't talked about is a new audience. And I've talked about this before. When I have a business and my wages go up because I have to do that to attract employees, fast food, for instance. Those private businesses get to pass on those costs through increased prices. And we pay more. Everybody knows we pay more at restaurants and things now because costs have gone up, the cost to have people come back to work for them. We don't have that luxury. We can't increase prices when we just add $5 million for a $22 versus a $20 starting wage. And the result is we end up with a deficit. So I guess what I'm saying is along the way, can we move that 3% ridership of San Diego up 1% by finding a new audience somehow? To find a new audience, you have to offer a new product or a revised product. And I guess what I'd like to plant a seed is some kind of test. years ago, I think MTS did a first mile, last mile program with Lyft. I think it was a $5 credit from the trolley station to your final destination via Lyft. That's an example of a new product or a new service that would maybe move that 3% ridership up a little bit. And that's what I'd like to plant a seed is what other new services could we do to help find new revenue, new riders, rather than just get more out of the existing system. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Council President?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the presentation here. Definitely, this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and we're going to need to, really put our minds to it as a board and obviously staff. I know you all are thinking about this I'm sure every day. So one of the things that, and I'll recognize on the front end that none of these things that I'm going to talk about would fill a $50 million hole. We'll name that. I am also of the belief that rarely in this line of work are there silver bullets that solve really complex problems all at once. And so rather than grasp for a magic solution, we cobble together the best that we can and try to get to where we're ultimately trying to go. So one of the things that I heard over the last couple of years in terms of interest from the board were additional revenue opportunities. And again, this is probably, we're talking about in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and the low millions on an annual basis rather than $50 million all at once. But I don't think that that's worth dismissing. So I would say that I'm open to any creative revenue opportunities, whether that means sponsorship for some of the programs that we offer, if it means billboards like the ones that we'll see downtown. MTS has some incredibly valuable advertising property. If we think about where our stops, our trolley stops and bus stops are throughout the city, and certainly before any sort of reduction in service levels, I would want to make sure that we've fully explored the opportunity to maximize revenue opportunities, especially those that don't have a direct impact on the folks who can least afford to absorb that impact. So whether that requires board support to seek a third-party analysis of potential revenue opportunities, I'll just say that I'm willing to pull that lever as far and hard as we can to see how we can make sure that the full array of MTS assets is utilized for revenue opportunities before we start seeking to reduce service levels at all or have any sort of financial impact on riders, especially the riders who can least afford it. Thank you, Chair.
Wonderful. So I think we have I'm sorry, go ahead, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for bringing this to us relatively early in the conversation, so we have some time. Really appreciate that. Count me in on what the Council President just said as well in terms of seeking additional revenue opportunities. I think that the sign that we're going to be putting up in downtown is an example of a creative revenue opportunity, and I think that there's real potential there. Of the options on the board, obviously to the degree that we can get assistance from state and federal governments, that would be terrific. I will say that it would pain me a lot to raise the cost of fares or reduce service levels at the same time that we are not capturing our current fares that we are asking people to pay. I mean, if there are folks that, obviously are riding without paying, I think it'd be pretty unfair to charge other people more as a result of that, because some of those people who are paying every time are struggling as well. And lastly, I am also interested in hearing more in terms of the COLA, certainly where we're seeing vacancies, to what degree we think, competitiveness may be a part of contributing to those vacancies, but also what the service level impacts or other impacts may be of those vacancies. I mean, all positions are important, but clearly some vacancies have more profound impacts than others. And I think that obviously we may want to look at prioritizing those. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, you guys, for this very robust discussion. I just want to loop back, and obviously this is an item, the operating budget, that we will be discussing later on in the year. Addressing our structural deficit. There was a comment about potentially utilizing revenues in the future. That's something that reserve revenues. We also heard we want to see which positions are experiencing a high number of vacancies. It's really interesting because most of the time when we in the city hear these discussions, it's through our union leaders, right? They're the ones that are doing the studies and are showing us all the numbers. So we're going to have to rely on you guys to give us that information. Obviously the drivers were brought up. So I think that's kind of a natural place where we could start and see what kind of incentives and what other agencies are doing for the drivers to keep them. I heard new services, potentially looking into new services. We do have federal stimulus dollars. I don't know how much it would cost to look into having new services here. I don't think it would be in the millions. So that's a potential source of funding to look into new services. Also, revenue opportunities were mentioned. Once again, the federal dollars are there to look at potential ways of generating revenue. Another thing that I would like to bring is I would like to bring our state and federal lobbyists to a future budget committee meeting so that we can discuss how we could move forward with addressing the deficit for our environmental requirements. So if we will be busy this year, but with that, thank you guys for your input. We are gonna, and thank you for the presentation. We appreciate as well. We appreciate you coming early on and for us to discuss this. We are gonna move on to item number 6. That was an informational item. So item number 6 is the San Diego Transit Defined Benefit Plan. It's gonna be presented by Larry Marinesi. Please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. I'll kick it off and then I'll turn it over to Mike. At the last meeting, we had talked about the defined contribution plan and we went through the actuarial analysis with regards to the San Diego Transit Pension Plan. So we wanted to come back to the Budget Development Committee to really kickstart an analysis that we'll do with regards to DC and defined contribution, defined benefit, and just talk about what our next steps are in the process. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
We wanted to give you first a little overview of the current environment for the San Diego Transit Pension Plan. So this defined benefit pension plan has been in place for a long time. It was closed to newly hired non-contract employees in 2011 and 2012 for the ATU and IB respectively. So at that point, all new hires employed in those two bargaining units are in a defined contribution plan. Now in that defined contribution plan or DC plan, MTS contributes the first 6%. If they contribute 2%, MTS will contribute another 2%. So they can get 10% total contribution if they put in 2%. That's how it's structured today in their agreement. The number of employees in that DC plan, you can see on the screen, there's 328 ATU employees and 121 IBW employees for a total of 450 actively in the DC plan. And the defined benefit plan, these active ones who were hired obviously before 2011, 2012, there's 331 of those. We also have another 1,100 that are in retirement pay status and another 184 that have terminated from San Diego Transit but did vest their benefits but are not eligible to retire yet. So there's overall 1,600 people in that defined benefit plan. That's what the actual report was presenting to you last month. The MTS board directed staff to study the DC to DB conversion. It's not straightforward as you would think. There is a lot of legislation around this. After those plans were closed in January of 2013, the Public Employees Pension Reform Act was passed and went into effect that January. PEPRA, as it's called, changes a lot of the rules for pensions in the state of California. It limits the maximum pension formula to 2% at 62, but does allow for lesser formulas. It requires each employee to contribute 50% of the normal cost. That's currently 7.75% for our PEPRA employees. And it also required that employee share to be paid by the actual employee. The employer couldn't just pick it up. So that's another rule in that legislation. It limited the amount of compensation and types of compensation that can be applied to each pension. It doesn't allow for retroactive benefit increases any longer. And there's also a number of other restrictions in this legislation. There's also some limitations on the CalPERS side. It's not just simple as taking these DC people and putting them into CalPERS, but we need a sort of a legal analysis of that as well. For example, CalPERS does not allow the same position to be in different plans. So if you have a driver in a DB plan on San Diego Transit, they wouldn't allow you to have a driver in a CalPERS plan. So it's very defined what's allowed, what's not allowed. There's also be the labor relation portion of that. We have current collective bargaining agreements that are in place through December 31st of 2024 for both ATU and IBEW. So any change to any sort of this would need to be collectively bargained as well with those unions. So the next steps are, given all these complexities for PEPRA and the plan design options and the collective bargaining considerations, is to engage consultants and attorneys to analyze the financial and legal considerations and figure out what's possible really. And then develop a range of pension formula options for the actuaries to then cost. And then we can bring that all back to the Budget Development Committee, see the budget impact of these various options and legal considerations. So that's our path forward at this point in time.
Thank you very much. Clerk, do we have any public comments?
No public comments.
Wonderful. I'm going to take Chair's prerogative again on this item. It's an informational item, but I do want to thank Mike and everybody in our finance staff for turning this around so quickly. I think this committee should absolutely have all the relevant legal and financial facts in front of us to determine a future course. So I look forward to reviewing that information at a future budget development committee. So thank you for that. Do we know when you will have that? I'm not rushing you. I just for the sake of scheduling.
Yeah, I mean, right now we're going through the budgetary process. A lot of our efforts are focused there, but we are going to begin the process of engaging the consultants and the attorneys to start looking at this. My guess is in the fall is probably when we'll be able to bring back, hopefully after the actuaries do their analysis and determine not only the agency costs, but the employee costs as well. We're hoping in the fall.
All right. So you guys heard it here. We're gonna the last year, I think the last meeting we had was in July. So we will be having a meeting in the fall this year. So get ready for that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my committee board members. Any comments or questions? Okay, hearing none. That was the last item. The one really quick thing before we end this meeting that I wanted to ask our chair is earlier I requested for the ADA paratransit item to come forward. I would respectfully request it come to the executive committee just to give the community ample time to have a discussion on that particular item. So with that, item number 7 is our next meeting date, which will be April 6th, 2023 at 9 a.m. And with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for your attendance and for your input today. The MTS Budget Development Committee is now officially adjourned. Have a great day, you guys.